Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm R. Indira, formerly Professor of Sociology at the University of Mysore and paper coordinator for the course Education and Society. The module on which my presentation is based is written by Dr. K.G. Gayatri Devi, formerly faculty at the Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. 1990 onwards saw remarkable changes in the field of both economy and education in India. And the economic changes were closely related to the changes that took place in the nature and content of education in India. One of the major shifts that took place in the field of education in India after 1990s was the shift that was seen in the concept of education itself as a primary service to a good, because the market started playing an important role in determining the content of education, the pedagogical practices that were involved, and the way in which knowledge itself was created and delivered. This was primarily due to the changes that followed economic liberalization policies. And there is an argument that this new type of education actually enlarged and widened the inequalities that existed in our society. So this module discusses the developments that took place in the field of education after 1990 and the kind of impact that it had on India's economic development. Status overview of education in India after 1991. The scenario of efforts to improve the educational levels of people in the country across caste, classes, religions, regions, age groups, physical fitness and gender, as what we discuss under the caption 1991 onwards, had already begun in the years prior to it. For example, even as early as in the year 1986, the state had already envisaged a national system of education in its draft National Policy on Education 1986 to 1992. Its idea was to bring about a nationwide common educational form with 10 plus 2 plus 3 as the structure. The breakup was the first 5 years as primary education, the next 2 years as upper primary education, and 3 years of high school education. The National Council of Educational Research and Training had been already set up by the Ministry of Education, Government of India in the year 1961 by merging 7 earlier institutions with the expectation that it would assist and advise the central and state ministries on matters of school education. Among its chief goals were universalizing elementary education, encouraging girls' education, introducing vocational education and national curriculum, among others. It also publishes textbooks for classes 1 to 12. Gaps in implementation and results and outcomes. Although the government had encouraged universal elementary education and placed a ban on child labor, its imposition was not effective due to the challenges of increasing poverty and displacement that the post-globalization years thrust upon the poor and vulnerable sections of the population. Political instability, migration of families, collapse of agricultural and allied occupations, and their inability to sufficiently support people's livelihoods, natural calamities, inflation, shortage of school infrastructures, teachers, unsatisfactory teacher-student ratio, all these were identified to be the causes of such backwardness. Efforts at improving the situation. Several measures were planned and implemented in the post-1991 years to check the drawbacks and bring about complete success in achieving the reforms in education. Some of the noteworthy efforts and actions of the government, civil society and others in improving education in India in the post-1991 years are shown below. District Education Revitalization Program. As early as in 1994, the District Education Revitalization Program was introduced by the central government. It was a partnership between the centre with 80% share of funding and the states with 20% share to revitalize universal education at the primary level. With the support of UNICEF, a number of new schools were opened across the country. Amendment to the National Policy on Education. The National Policy on Education 1986 came to be amended in the year 1992 to assist those sections of Indian society considered vulnerable because of their continued inability to access education besides other vulnerabilities. Religious minorities, particularly Indian Muslims, are one among them. The area-intensive program for educationally backward minorities was initiated along with a scheme for financial support to madrasas in 1994. Affiliations started to be granted to minority institutions by 2004. Kendriya Vidyalayas, Bal Bhavans and women's groups. Besides the reservation of 15% of seats already provided for the SCs and 7.5% for STs in Kendriya Vidyalayas, special provisions were made for scheduled tribes hailing from the remote regions such as the northeast, consisting of 7 tribal dominant states under the non-lapsable central pool of resources in 1999. The Mahila Samakhya, an organization of the central government, initiated a special program in 1989 for women from poor households to obtain awareness about the benefits of education for their children and adult education for themselves. Huge sums of money were allocated for this purpose, covering villages and districts in the country in phases. Setting up of Bal Bhavans for educational and cultural activities by children to encourage their talent, national level book fairs, exhibitions, competitive examinations in arts and crafts like drawing and painting, sports and games and swimming, yoga, health awareness camps, environment protection programs and many others like these were part of the efforts to establish education as a comprehensive program for personality development. Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. The Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, meaning education for all, is hailed as one of the largest educational initiatives in the world, so far as elementary education is concerned in India. It is in fact a movement towards achieving literacy or universalization of elementary education in a time-bound and targeted manner. The program attains its added significance due to the fact that it resulted from the 86th Amendment of the Constitution of India in 2001, thereby declaring that elementary education for all children in the age group of 6 years to 14 years is compulsory and a fundamental right. In introducing this program, the government took lead from the already existing district primary education program of 1993, operated in phases and as a collaborative program of the centre and the states, supported by external funding agencies like the World Bank, DFID of UK and UNICEF. The DPEP was a massive program with a lot of success in enrolling the vulnerable sections of society like the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes and girls to elementary schools. Right to Education Act 2009. The Parliament of India passed the historic Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act on August 4, 2009 under Article 21A of the Constitution. Education became a fundamental right of every child of 6 to 14 years of age. It also made it mandatory that up to 25% of seats in private educational institutions must be compulsorily reserved for children from vulnerable or disadvantaged sections of society such as SCs, STs and religious minorities. This act has come in for a lot of criticism and is not fully operational due to non-cooperation of private institutions, official apathy, etc. Many private schools held it as an intrusion into their privacy and infringement of rules. Several of them petitioned against the act in the Supreme Court of India. The RTE Act was held as being hastily imposed and as a duplication of the already existing DPEP. Other levels of education. Secondary, higher secondary, pre-university and college education are the other levels of education that have grown complex and focused as the economy of the country came under the influence of global policies, particularly with reference to employment. A number of revisions of curricula were made under directions from the University Grants Commission, NCERT and CBSE. Engineering, medical and business administration came under the limelight due to increased job opportunities and rising status within the job market. Child dropout and child labor. Mainstreaming children who have dropped out of school was given utmost importance by training such children. Like them, children who leave education to take up employment as child laborers also received greater attention. National and state level enactments were passed curbing child labor, particularly by children below 12 or 14 years of age and forced to work in dangerous places in hazardous occupations and with highly negative health impacts and risks to life. The International Labour Organization's declarations also had their strong impact on these enactments. The National Child Labour Project and State Child Labour Projects are examples here. The departments of HRD and Labour joined hands to trace such working children through labour officers supported by non-governmental organizations. The latter have been given permission to start bridge schools to accommodate these children who are later mainstreamed into regular schools with hostel facilities. Education for the disabled or the differentially abled. The earlier program of 1974 for the disabled children was revived for better inclusion and facilitating creative learning. Development is understood in traditional terms as a mere yardstick of income. But the post-1980s saw an upsurge of interest and review in understanding what development is. One of the significant results of this realization was to align development with education as resulting from a direct relationship between educational advancement and economic development. For example, not all nations with high literacy are highly developed, and not all rich nations have equally corresponding wealth as their educational level. The UNDP declared in 2013 that the Gulf countries are oil-rich but poor in educational standards. In India itself, in the state of Karnataka, the district of Bellary occupies the 4th place in terms of its GDP and 9th place in income index. But when we take its educational level, it ranks in the 18th place in HDI and 23rd place in its educational level. Thus, advancement in economic terms alone is not enough for development. It is therefore fitting that the government has attached a lot of significance to improving people's educational level through conspicuous interventions and policies. This is supposed to lead to a well-integrated economy with society and all-round development. The census 2011 boasts of approximately 1/3 of its total number of children in the 7 to 10 years age group as being literate with improved attendance rate. The report of the status of education 2012 announced that 96.5% of all rural children in the age group of 6 to 14 years have been enrolled in schools. The objective of achieving universal education is not only to increase enrollment but also to retain the enrolled children in schools. Attendance and learning completion are two important indicators in this context. Here one has to acknowledge the support by the district education programs, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan incentive programs such as free distribution of uniforms, textbooks, bicycles, offering of scholarships and importantly the noon or midday meals program. However, in many cases, the schools are not genuine in reporting true attendance in classes for fear of punishment, as it is one of their duties to monitor regular attendance in classes. Likewise, the impact of MDM on attendance in classes and retention rate is evidently good. Besides this, it also has helped in improving the nutritional level of the students, awareness about sanitation, and increased equity between various castes and classes and gender. Dropout cases are not always reported to be out of poverty compulsions, But research has shown that several students have opted to drop out of the school due to inability to grasp and inefficiency of learning on the part of the concerned students. Dropout is also heavily caused by social compulsions such as casteist feelings causing guilt, abandonment, humiliation, sexual violence on girls in the school by either the teacher or fellow students, poverty of parents, home-based traditional occupations, male child labor, lack of conviction of parents in education, superstitions, early marriage, and women-headed households. Thus, the societal reasons are still operative in arresting the attendance of poor students and girls in schools and colleges. The transition rate is reported to be low for students from rural areas and hailing from SC, ST, and other backward classes and girls. For the latter, attaining maturity is a major cause of dropping out and not transiting to the next class, particularly if the same village or town has no such school. Although in most schools and colleges, the teacher-pupil ratio is reasonably good, the number of working teachers as against sanctioned posts of teachers is low in many cases. Infrastructure in the schools and higher educational institutions is also a major impediment to learning. This is true of tribal areas and backward rural pockets of the country. Although under the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, a lot of attention is given to provisioning school infrastructure such as building classrooms, girls' toilets, general toilets, provision for drinking water, compound wall, kitchen for MDM, playground, library and reading room, and computers. In reality, due to bureaucratic and Gram Panchayat created hassles, not much improvement is seen. Teaching materials have been provided in plenty, but teachers' ability to transfer is not visible in students' learning capabilities. This is evident in the pass percentage of students in the examinations. After schooling, the course to which a student gets admitted to also matters in providing an assured employment later in life. With greater or added emphasis on primary or elementary education, the higher education sector is increasingly becoming privatized and under capitalistic systems where the welfare programs of the government for the vulnerable groups fail to be respected and implemented. Skill development programs such as tailoring, embroidery, painting, woolen knitting, carpentry, handicrafts are significant as self-employment avenues. The participation by the community or society is critical in making any government program a successful one. Adult literacy programs are striving to make the adult population in rural, tribal and other backward regions actively involved in development activities. The women in the self-help groups are one of the groups for adult literacy in many places. But the women in grassroots leadership roles are not involved in these activities. There are no integrated activities by all the actors like the members of the School Development and Management Committee, of the Gram Panchayat, women in the self-help groups and other local organizations. Parents' occupation has emerged as a chief indicator of children's educational aspirations and achievements as it is the backbone of the household's economy. Thus, poor households where the father is unemployed or earns very less have very poor standards of living and people have no assets. Landless laborers are often at the mercy of employment availability and tend to migrate out of the village in search of livelihood. This sort of economic and spatial displacement is disastrous to education of their children. Migration of parents has continued unabated due to failure of rains, consequent crop loss, large families to support, caste conflicts in the place of origin, etc. Girls and women are the worst sufferers in all these uprooting. As compared to boys, girls are more prone to drop out of school due to these domestic and marriage-related reasons. Despite several decades of legislative and political enforcement, social inequality based on caste is ubiquitous to Indian society and continues to haunt any democratic move to bring about change in traditional practices. Caste-based restrictions continue to force students to drop out of school due to poverty, low caste status, and marginalized status. In conclusion, it can be said that the period after 1990s saw both ups and downs. While the number of institutions imparting certain unique types of education multiplied and opportunities expanded for different sections of India's population to access different courses that were primarily created in response to the new jobs that virtually invaded the Indian markets, it's also true that the role of the private sector in India's educational sector created a further cleavage between what we may call, the privileged groups and those that were denied of these privileges. While it's true that the country is proud of the achievements in the field of education, the expansion that has taken place, and the new types of courses that have been introduced, and the opportunities that have been created for young boys and girls from different sections of the society to access these courses, the wide gap between the rich and the poor, the rural and the urban, still exists. So the new courses, the expansion in education will become meaningful only when we are able to bridge these social inequalities by using education as an instrument.